Hello, this is Dr. Eric B. Villard from the U.S. Army Center of Military History, here to give you a few vignettes on the history of exploration in the Army. First up is Zebulon Pike's second expedition of 1806-1807. Zebulon M. Pike was born in Trenton, New Jersey on 5 January 1779. His father, also named Zebulon, served in the Revolutionary Army. The younger Zebulon appears to have entered military service in 1799, and by 1802 held the rank of first lieutenant in the 1st Regiment of the U.S. Army. By 1805, he had become aide-de-camp to Brigadier General James Wilkinson, the senior officer of the U.S. Army. Wilkinson was a controversial figure. He had resigned twice from the Continental Army during the Revolution due to falling out with his political opponents. He was a talented military commander and administrator. He was charming, but he was also manipulative and was always looking to make money. After the Revolution, Wilkinson became a spy for Spain, who wanted to know what the new United States was doing as it expanded westward. Wilkinson restored his political influence after the Revolution and became the senior officer of the U.S. Army from 1796 to 1798, and again from 1800 to 1812. He also became the first governor of the Louisiana Territory in 1805. During that time, he continued to send secret information to Spain, which again was concerned about U.S. expansion into its colonial territories. In 1805, Wilkinson ordered Pike to conduct an expedition to locate the source of the Missouri River in the Louisiana Territory. Pike accomplished that mission in 1805 and 1806. Almost immediately upon Pike's return, Wilkinson ordered him to mount a second and more ambitious expedition. This included negotiating a peace between the Kansas and Osage tribes and attempting to make contact with the Comanche people on the High Plains. Pike was also ordered to explore the headwaters of the Arkansas River, proceed south, locate the source of the Red River, and then descend to the Mississippi. So Lewis and Clark, who were operating farther to the north, Pike was taking a more southern route. Like Lewis and Clark, Pike was also supposed to report on the natural resources that he found along the way. Pike brought with him nearly all the soldiers from his first expedition, men he called damn set of rascals, but these were guys that he had confidence in. General Wilkinson's son, Lieutenant James Biddle Wilkinson, was also part of the team and was second in command. Now, Wilkinson launched the second expedition with Pike without the authorization of President Johnson or the War Department, although they retroactively approved it later. Now, what Wilkinson was really up to remains a mystery. Now, it's possible that in collaboration with Aaron Burr, Wilkinson was, in fact, planning some sort of traitorous movement to separate the new Louisiana territories from the United States and maybe set up his own country or empire. It's also possible Wilkinson was simply looking for information about the territory that he could use on behalf of the United States, but that's a charitable explanation. Now, Pike himself almost certainly knew nothing about the Wilkinson-Burr conspiracy, but his mission was to gather as much intelligence as he could and bring it back. Zebulon Pike left Fort Bellefontaine on July 15, 1806, with 19 enlisted 1st Infantrymen and NCOs, a physician, an interpreter, and Lieutenant Wilkinson. Upon reaching the Arkansas River, Wilkinson left the party, went back with 5 men, and returned to St. Louis. So Pike and 15 others pressed on. In late October, they caught the trail of a troop of Spanish cavalry and decided to go west and follow them. On November 11, Pike made a bold decision. Even though winter was coming, he decided to press on basically to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. And they got to what is now the modern site of Pueblo, Colorado on November 23. Now, at that point, Pike saw in the distance a blue peak that fascinated him, and he decided he would go explore it. So he set out on the 24th with 2 soldiers and a doctor, leaving the rest of the guys back at Pueblo. Now, Pike thought he could probably reach the mountain by evening, but after 2 days and marching 24 miles, the mountains seemed no closer. Now, with the deepening snow, the freezing temperatures, and a lack of cold weather gear, Pike basically recognized that there was no way to go forward, so he turned back while he was still around 16 miles short of the mountain. So he never climbed it on that expedition. In his journal, he called it the Blue Mountain or the Grand Peak. Only later, about in the 1850s, was the name Pike's Peak affixed to that particular hill. So after leaving Pueblo, Pike continued his mission, but circumstances grew worse as the winter set in and food supply dropped dramatically. He was forced to build a stockade, and in late February, a troop of Spanish soldiers found them and basically said, "Hey, you're in Spanish territory, come with us." So Pike and his men accompanied them to Santa Fe. The Spanish were actually quite nice about it, all things considered. Gave them food, warm blankets, didn't confiscate any of their military equipment. And eventually, Pike and his men were returned to U.S. territory in 1807. Now, after this, Pike rose quickly in the Army, and in 6 years gained the rank of Brigadier General. Unlike Lewis and Clark, however, Pike nor his men got any sort of extra pay or land grants for their expedition. Zebulon Pike met his fate during the War of 1812 when he led a successful attack on York in Canada. He was killed on April 27, 1813, fatally wounded by flying debris when a powder magazine exploded. He is buried in Sackett's Harbor, New York, the home base of his operations. That brings us to our second episode, Henry T. Allen's Alaska Expedition of 1885. Henry T. Allen was born in Kentucky in 1859, graduated from West Point in 1882. He took his first assignment in Alaska in 1884. Now, Allen loved the wilderness of Alaska and lobbied Brigadier General Nelson A. Miles, who was the commander of the Department of the Columbia, for a chance to lead an expedition into the remote interior. In January 1885, Miles issued an order which read, "Second Lieutenant Henry T. Allen, 2nd Cavalry, acting aide-de-camp, is authorized to make a reconnaissance in Alaska, proceeding up the Copper River and down the Tanana River Valley. In view of the fact that so little is known about the interior of the territory of Alaska, and that the conflicting interests between the white people and the Indians of that territory may, in the near future, result in serious disturbances between the two races, the department commander authorizes you to proceed to that territory for the purpose of obtaining all information which will be valuable and important, especially to the military branch of the government." So one of the primary tasks of this expedition for Allen was to study the natives of the interior. Now, these Alaskans had been wards of the United States for around 2 decades, but the government knew little to nothing about them. And so Allen was to go in and find out more about these people. In addition, of course, he was tasked with collecting geographic data, particularly aspects of the terrain, flora, and fauna that may have an impact on military operations. Things like, was there a forage for animals? What's the ability of the countryside to sustain a military force? So Allen's command was small. It was Sergeant Katie Robertson of E Troop, 2nd Cavalry, Private Frederick W. Fickett of the Signal Corps, 2 civilian prospectors, and about a dozen native guides. Now, this was not the first attempt to ascend the Copper River. There had been some Russian attempts and a few American efforts, but they had not gotten very far. So after preparing their gear, Allen's party headed up the Copper River on 29 March 1885. Now, on the second day of the journey, the difficulty in traveling through soft snow, broken ice, and fast-flowing water forced the party to abandon much of its stores, including half the ammunition, a tent, clothing, and some food. So now they were down to about 350 pounds of food. That was, 4 days of rations, and more or less they were subsisting on rabbit stew thickened with a bit of flour. On 13 April, they met up with a local native who shared some scavenged moose meat from a wolf kill. This rotten moose meat was Lieutenant Allen's birthday feast. Bad as it was, Lieutenant Allen stated, "If we had been so fortunate as to obtain even rotten moose meat a few days later, it would have been none of the party too dainty to enjoy it." Beggars can't be choosers, and by 28 May, the party was so low on food, Fickett wrote in his journal, "Had a little paste, rotten and wormy meat for dinner, rotten goose eggs, and a little rice for supper. Each meal was about 1/4 of what we needed." So by this point, they'd been on the trail for 2.5 months, covered some 500 miles, and on 5 June began the ascent of the interior mountains, looking for a pass to bring them to the other side, to the headwaters of the Tanana River. After marching a few miles, salmon appeared in the small stream next to the trail. Now, these fish had traveled hundreds of miles from the mouth of the Copper River and now were at the end of their journey to spawn. And the fish, of course, were a delight to the team because this was one of the few occasions where everyone was able to eat his fill. So on 8 June, Allen and his small party finally reached the top of the summit, and he wrote, "From this, the most grateful sight it has ever been my fortune to witness was presented. The sun was rising, but not in the east, in fact, just 2 points east of north. We had nearly reached the land of the midnight sun." So from that point, they followed the mountains down and down the Tanana River all the way to the Yukon and then to the sea 800 miles away. So it was a trip totaling around 1,600 miles. And of that 1,600 miles, 1,200 was territory the U.S. government had never explored. So after that, Henry T. Allen went on for a distinguished career. He retired from the Army in 1923 as a major general, and he commanded the American occupation forces in Germany right after World War I. He passed in August 1930. So that brings us to our third and final episode, Major General John B. Medeiros and the Juno 1 Explorer 1 launch. Medeiros was born in Ohio in 1902, served in the Marine Corps in France during World War I, and with the Army in the Mediterranean European theater in World War II. In February 1956, he gained command of the Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, the site of the Army's rocket development program. Medeiros worked there with a group of former German scientists, chief among them Werner von Braun, who had developed Germany's rocket program. Now, Medeiros, von Braun, and the other members of the team developed a long-range rocket that could deliver a satellite into orbit, or a missile payload, but the Department of Defense told them to stop work on the project. The DoD favored the U.S. Navy's Vanguard rocket program at the time, and the Air Force and Navy also objected to the Army building a long-range missile because they thought that would create competition in the strategic nuclear program in the U.S. military. Well, everything changed on 4 October 1957, when the Soviets launched Sputnik 1 into orbit, the first Earth satellite in space. So when the Vanguard program ran into trouble, the DoD ordered the Redstone team to modify its Juno 1 rockets to carry a satellite. The first Juno 1 launched on 31 January 1958, sending the Explorer 1 satellite into space. 2 months later, the DoD appointed Medeiros as the commander of the Army Ordnance Missile Command. So that put him in charge of the Army Ballistic Missile Agency at Redstone, plus the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California, and the Army Missile Firing Laboratory at Cape Canaveral, Florida. In July 1958, the government created NASA to oversee all scientific programs on non-military launch vehicles for space. And so the Army's brief career in the space program essentially came to an end. Medeiros was offered a promotion to lieutenant general, but he decided to retire from the Army in January 1960. He became an Anglican priest later in life and passed in 1990. But I think it's fair to say that he should be remembered truly as the father of the Army space program. So I hope you've enjoyed this short presentation. Look at the links below to see if you want to get more information from the Center of Military History or from my social media.